Obi-Wan Kenobi is remembered as wise, largely because he is quiet, measured, and rarely raises his voice. And in a galaxy defined by spectacle and volatility, stillness reads as insight by default, creating the impression of mastery without demanding proof of clarity, especially when contrasted against louder and more volatile figures around him, which allows composure itself to be mistaken for understanding rather than examined as a possible defense mechanism. This perception hardens over time because Obi-Wan survives, and survival in Star Wars is often retroactively framed as wisdom, even when it is born from endurance rather than enlightenment. And the longer he remains standing, the more his calmness is interpreted as philosophical resolution instead of emotional attrition, masking the distinction between knowing what is right and simply knowing how to keep going. From the outside, Obi-Wan appears centered, but that center is rarely interrogated, because the narrative and the audience both accept restraint as virtue without asking what it costs, or whether it is chosen freely rather than adopted as the only viable way to function, especially within an institution that rewards obedience and punishes doubt. When examined closely, Obi-Wan's calm often reads less like serenity and more like containment, a deliberate narrowing of emotional bandwidth designed to prevent collapse rather than cultivate insight. And that distinction matters because one produces growth while the other merely delays reckoning, preserving form while hollowing out substance. This is where the illusion of wisdom takes root, because Obi-Wan performs stability so consistently that it becomes indistinguishable from resolution, even though the narrative repeatedly shows him absorbing loss without processing it, adapting behaviourally while remaining philosophically static, and mistaking endurance for evolution. His relationship to Jedi doctrine reinforces this impression, as he frequently recites its principles with fluency and confidence, not because he has re-examined them and reaffirmed their value, but because they are familiar, reliable, and emotionally safer than uncertainty, allowing him to operate within a rigid framework that spares him from confronting how much the framework itself is failing. Obi-Wan's adherence to the code often feels habitual rather than reflective, as though repetition itself offers comfort, a way to anchor identity in rules when personal conviction has been eroded by grief, compromise, and institutional inertia, turning doctrine into a coping mechanism rather than a living philosophy. This is particularly evident in how he responds to crisis, where his guidance tends to arrive after catastrophe rather than before it, positioning him as a stabilizer rather than a visionary, someone who mitigates damage once it has occurred, but rarely alters the trajectory that leads there, which reframes his wisdom as reactive rather than generative. Throughout the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan is repeatedly placed in situations where foresight might have changed outcomes, yet his responses remain tethered to protocol and patience, even as those tools prove insufficient, suggesting not a lack of intelligence, but a reluctance to deviate from roles that define his sense of self and moral safety. His calm thus becomes a form of emotional triage, managing the immediate shock of events without addressing their deeper implications, allowing him to function effectively in the moment while quietly accumulating unresolved grief that never finds articulation, let alone resolution. The losses Obi-Wan carries are immense, beginning with Qui-Gon Jinn, whose death forces Obi-Wan into premature responsibility, requiring him to step into mentorship before he has fully integrated his own beliefs, creating a fracture where duty replaces self-discovery and survival replaces reflection. That fracture widens with each subsequent loss, including Satine Kryze, whose existence represents an alternate life. Obi-Wan consciously refuses, not because he has resolved that sacrifice, but because acknowledging its weight would destabilize the identity he relies on to keep moving forward. By the time of Star Wars, the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan's demeanor has settled into something practiced and automatic, a tone of gentle authority that rarely wavers, not because doubt has been eliminated, but because engaging with it would require emotional energy he no longer has to spare. His interactions with Anakin Skywalker further expose this pattern, as Obi-Wan often defaults to correction rather than exploration, discipline rather than dialogue, responding to instability by reinforcing structure instead of addressing its root causes, a choice that prioritizes immediate order over long-term understanding. In this light, Obi-Wan's wisdom appears less like insight born of contemplation and more like a posture refined through necessity, a way of holding himself together in a war that erodes meaning faster than it produces answers, leaving him operational but unchanged, functional but philosophically exhausted. By the end of the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan has not arrived at deeper clarity. He has simply learned how to endure without breaking, a skill that reads as wisdom in a collapsing system, but is ultimately indistinguishable from emotional survival, setting the stage for a man who appears serene, not because he has found peace, but because he's learned how not to feel. By the time the war reaches its breaking point, Obi-Wan is no longer actively choosing restraint. He is defaulting to it, operating on emotional autopilot because conscious engagement would require confronting a cumulative weight of failure that has long since exceeded his capacity to process, turning discipline into reflex and obedience into insulation rather than conviction. This is where the distinction between wisdom and exhaustion becomes unavoidable, because Obi-Wan's restraint is not consistently paired with insight, and his calm does not lead to reorientation or reform, but instead maintains forward motion within a system that is visibly collapsing, suggesting that what sustains him is not clarity but momentum. Rather than interrogating his own role in that collapse, Obi-Wan frequently reframes events as inevitabilities, leaning on phrases like the will of the Force not as philosophical conclusions, but as emotional shields, a way to externalize responsibility and avoid asking whether different choices might have mattered. Invoking destiny in this way allows Obi-Wan to remain functional without becoming introspective, preserving his identity as a faithful servant while quietly surrendering agency. Because if events are ordained, then failure becomes tragic but impersonal, something to endure rather than understand. This pattern is reinforced whenever Obi-Wan faces moral crossroads, where he consistently prioritizes adherence over examination, choosing alignment with authority even when that authority has demonstrated its blindness, not because he lacks the capacity to question, but because questioning would require rebuilding a worldview he no longer has the energy to reconstruct. His loyalty, often praised as steadfastness, increasingly resembles inertia, a continuation of motion without direction, where walking away would demand emotional reckoning, and staying the course allows him to remain useful without being whole, a trade he accepts silently and repeatedly. What makes this especially tragic is that Obi-Wan is aware on some level that the system is broken, yet he lacks the emotional bandwidth to challenge it meaningfully, resulting in a man who sees the cracks but continues to brace the walls rather than step back and ask whether the structure should stand at all. This is not the behaviour of a serene master, but of a caretaker in burnout, someone who manages decline rather than prevents it, and whose composure is born not from peace, but from prolonged exposure to loss, where emotional numbness becomes the only sustainable state. The culmination of this trajectory arrives with the fall of the Order, where Obi-Wan survives, not because he has adapted philosophically, but because he has already hollowed himself out emotionally, making survival possible at the cost of vitality, insight, and self-trust. In exile, this reality becomes undeniable, as Obi-Wan's solitude strips away the performance of wisdom and reveals the fatigue underneath, a man left alone with memories he never processed and choices he never fully examined, forced at last to confront the emptiness that discipline alone could not fill. Even then, his first instinct is not reflection but withdrawal, retreating into watchfulness rather than reckoning, because engagement still feels too dangerous, and because the habits that kept him alive through war now keep him static in peace, reinforcing the idea that survival has replaced growth as his primary function. It is only when Obi-Wan begins to reconnect emotionally, rather than ideologically, that genuine wisdom has the opportunity to emerge, suggesting that his earlier composure was never the destination, only a holding pattern, a necessary but incomplete stage in a longer process he was never allowed to finish. Seen through this lens, Obi-Wan Kenobi is not a paragon of enlightened detachment during the Clone Wars, but a profoundly loyal man whose identity is so tightly bound to service that he mistakes endurance for understanding and obedience for peace. His tragedy is not that he failed to act, but that he acted constantly, without space to feel, reflect or reorient, becoming the perfect stabilizer for a system in decline, while slowly losing access to his own interior life. What audiences often read as wisdom is therefore better understood as resilience under duress, a controlled narrowing of self that allows function without fulfillment. And while that resilience is admirable, it is not the same as clarity, and conflating the two obscures the cost of such prolonged emotional suppression. In the end, Obi-Wan's calm is real, but it is not complete, earned not through resolution but through repetition, and maintained not by insight but by loyalty, leaving behind a figure who appears enlightened only because he has learned how to carry unbearable weight without letting it show.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.